We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Libertarian Institute writes, U.S. and Chinese officials warn of looming conflict over Taiwan. Tensions between China and the U.S. continue to escalate as Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin warned of a Ukraine-like crisis in Taiwan, accusing Beijing of pursuing, quote, aggressive, end quote, foreign policies after trading threats over the disputed island with his Chinese counterpart. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He's a historian who currently holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book that has just been released is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So in a speech in Singapore on Sunday, Austin claimed that Washington had witnessed a steady increase in provocative and destabilizing military activity near Taiwan. The PRC's moves threaten to undermine security, stability, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. That's crucial for this region, and it's crucial for the wider world. He went on to claim that China had disregarded the rules-based international order, and China is following a more coercive and aggressive approach to its territorial claims, and claiming this could spark a Ukraine-like conflict over Taiwan. Dr. Horne, as soon as a U.S. official interjects, disregarded the rules-based international order, I had a problem with that analysis, and following a more coercive and aggressive approach, I have to ask Secretary Austin if he knows the difference between offense and defense. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, certainly the rules-based international order, so-called, is very problematic. That is to say that it's a concept that is embraced fundamentally in Washington, perhaps in the capitals of its North Atlantic allies, but it does not hold the same heft and weight as international law, which flows from the United Nations Security Council. In other words, Rubio, the rules-based international order, is an attempt to do an end run around the United Nations Security Council, where Washington obviously does not always get its way. But it's important for your audience to recognize that the United States is in quite a quandary today. The front pages of our newspapers today are replete with headlines about the point that the Biden administration is on the verge of rolling back the tariffs against Chinese imports from China to the United States, or exports from China to the United States market, which Mr. Trump had sought to impose and did impose during the midst of the so-called trade war. And so here you have this anomaly of Washington talking about confronting China, but not able to move away from the Chinese products that help to depress inflation. In other words, Washington, U.S. imperialism, has constructed this dysfunctional relationship where it's heavily dependent upon the country that it wishes to confront, speaking of the People's Republic of China. That is an unsustainable proposition, which has given rise to the informed speculation that planet Earth may be on the verge of a monumental transition, a transition away from the hegemony and domination of the North Atlantic countries with the baton passed post-1945 from London to Washington, but now with the baton passing across the Pacific to the People's Republic of China, which will have enormous consequences, not only for capitalism, not only for anti-communism, the secular religion of the United States, but of course, enormous consequences for capitalism itself. And what's even more striking is that you have the so-called allies of the United States who seem quite prepared to go down with the ship. I'm speaking of these confrontations in Chinese waters, or just on the other side of Chinese waters, between Chinese forces and jets from Canada and Australia. Now, Canada has a population that's not larger than the black population of the United States of America. Australia's population is smaller than that, and yet they have the gumption to try to confront the People's Republic of China, which then, of course, brings us to Mr. Biden, who was confronted with the spectacle of a joint Russian-Chinese military exercise as Mr. Biden was beating the war drums in Northeast Asia just a few weeks ago. And this military exercise supposedly was coincidental, but obviously was a direct signal to U.S. imperialism. And Mr. Biden, if he can remember this, because without sounding ageist, he does seem to have a problem with his memory, he should be reminded that repeatedly with these tabletop exercises, where there's a confrontation between U.S. forces and Chinese forces, there have been 19 of these tabletop exercises. The United States has come out of the short end of the stick. You guessed it, 19 times. So Washington better really slow down, slow its roll, because it's cruising for a bruising, and it won't be pretty, least of all to those of us who are stuck on this ship of fools. And I think I should add one more point before I pass the microphone, which is that your listeners should realize that the way the United States got into this dilemma in 2022 has historical echoes. What I mean is that 2022 is driven by the point that Washington, as you know, is confronting Russia and Ukraine, and that's stage one of a confrontation with the People's Republic of China. What happened 50 years ago was that Nixon went to China, U.S. President Richard M. Nixon, in order to effectuate an anti-Soviet entente, anti-Moscow entente with China. The United States was on the back foot then, enduring all manner of revolutions or impending revolutions across the globe, including Nicaragua, Iran, Grenada, even Afghanistan, believe it or not. And this was a kind of Hail Mary pass, to use the U.S. football jargon, that in a sense worked, although it only worked for a brief period of time because China received in return massive foreign direct investment, which has created this juggernaut. The United States now is trying to unscramble the egg, is willing to destroy planet Earth in order to do so, unless we are able to grab the wheel of the ship of state and steer this ship of state to calmer waters.
So let me ask you about something you had mentioned, because the U.S. obviously had, albeit a bad plan, they had a plan. And the plan was they're going to confront Russia, which is China's junior ally, as they saw it. They were going to weaken Russia. They were going to build a coalition of, NATO would now get stronger. They would then also at the same time build this Asian coalition. Then they're all ready to confront China. NATO's stronger, Russia's weaker, the coalition in Asia is strong, and now they're ready to confront China. None of those things worked. Russia's making more money than ever. Russia's making so much money they're having trouble to figure out how to spend it. NATO literally... We've got people in NATO now who are gathering firewood. They have returned to the time of hunter-gatherers because they don't have the proper energy, and country after country is falling. And the Asian coalition is all leaning towards China. None of their plan has worked, but yet they're acting as though it is worked flawlessly. Dr. Horne, your thoughts on all of that?
Well, actually, the grim scenario you have sketched may be a bit too favorable, believe it or not, to U.S. imperialism. What I mean is, if you begin to look at this so-called anti-China alliance, speaking of the Quad, United States, Japan, Australia, India, India is becoming quite wobbly with regard to this Quad. As you know, it's under enormous pressure because it refuses to break relations with Russia, which is allied in turn with China. And there are those in Washington who are wondering how can India be a credible member of the anti-China coalition when India, in turn, is yoked to Russia, not only in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but also through other means as well. And then, just like the plan to enlist China against Russia, against Moscow, backfired over recent decades, you see something similar happening with regard to Japan. I think that Washington will live to rue the day that it encouraged increased military spending in Japan. Obviously, they have short memories. Obviously, there is little memory of World War II. And the fact that Washington thought that the only way it could defeat Japan during World War II was to engage in nuclear annihilation in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And it seems that Washington would like to replay that ghastly history by playing with fire, encouraging Japanese militarism, hoping that it can be turned against China and not turned across the Pacific to the United States of America. That is a bet that I would not want to make if I were in Washington.
Joe Biden talks about we have to ensure diplomacy and foreign assistance are working to promote the rights of individuals. But at every turn, it is militarism and economic militarism that seem to be the first two plays in the Biden playbook. So on the one hand, now Joe Biden is talking about sanctions and tariffs, removing them against China, while Lloyd Austin is talking about invading Taiwan, provoking China. We see this same. We've got the same situation in Venezuela, where they're going hat in hand, begging Maduro for oil, but still telling Juan Guaido, "You're our guy." He's on his way now to Saudi Arabia. First visit is to Israel, and then going to the West Bank. He should go to the West Bank first. They keep making the same wrong moves. Every single play is the wrong play.
Well, the problem for Mr. Biden and the class that he represents, with all due respect, they don't have many options. U.S. imperialism is basically a one-trick pony. It invests heavily in the military and doesn't invest heavily necessarily in K through 12 education, except to harden school doors so that 18-year-olds cannot invade with their assault rifles and kill 10-year-olds. And then if you look at the so-called Indo-Pacific economic framework, it's basically an insult to those Asian nations who are being enticed because they can turn instead to China and the One Belt, One Road initiative and the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which basically exponentially surpasses the Indo-Pacific economic framework of Washington, which is tossing peanuts and insults to nations like Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, etc. So perhaps, Wilmer, you need to be a bit more charitable towards Mr. Biden. He doesn't have that many options. He has a playbook that does not have that many plays, and that's one of the reasons why he's limping so badly.
Well, obviously, I need to enroll in the Professor Gerald Horne School of of generosity, because I got to sit at the knee. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate your analysis and your charity, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Critical